He had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous man in the room. A decorated Navy SEAL operator, a widowed father fighting to keep his sick daughter alive. And one rainy Thursday night, one act of defiance against a powerful man that got him fired, broke, and standing on the edge of losing everything. What happened next? No one saw coming. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where ordinary people make extraordinary choices, and the stories we tell will shake you to your core. Drop a like if you believe integrity still matters, and tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from tonight? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The rain had been coming down since 4 in the afternoon, and by the time Damon Cross stepped out of the metro station on Caldwell Avenue, it was coming down sideways. He pulled the collar of his jacket up, not because it helped much, but because it was something to do with his hands. He walked fast, the way he always did, head slightly down, eyes scanning the street from under his brow, the old habit from years he didn't talk about anymore. 3 blocks to the parking garage, then 40 minutes on the highway, then Emma. That was the sequence. That was what got him through most days. He was 37 years old, and he looked it, not in a washed-out way, but in the way of a man who had carried weight for long enough that it had become part of his structure. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there at 30, a scar along his left jaw that he sometimes forgot existed until someone stared at it too long. His hands were too rough for an office job, and he knew it, and so did everyone at Hargrove Logistics who'd ever shaken one of them. He'd been working as a logistics data analyst for 2 years and 8 months. He knew the exact number because he'd started counting the day he realized the job was going nowhere, and he kept counting because stopping felt like giving up. The work wasn't hard, not the way hard used to mean anything to him, but it paid mostly, and it had health coverage, and the health coverage was the whole point. Emma was 8. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, quick, the kind that noticed everything. And she had her mother's way of talking to strangers like she'd known them for years. She also had her mother's lungs, which was the part that kept Damon awake at 3 in the morning more nights than he could count. Severe persistent asthma, the pulmonologist had called it, the first time, in that careful clinical tone doctors use when they want to avoid the word serious. The medications alone ran close to $900 a month before insurance. The specialist visits, the twice-yearly pulmonary function tests, the emergency room co-pays during bad flare-ups. Damon had stopped adding it up because the total made his chest feel like someone was standing on it. He managed. That was the word he used when people asked. He managed. What that actually looked like. 2 credit cards with balances he wasn't proud of. A savings account with enough to last maybe 3 months if he was careful. And a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that had been described charitably as transitional by the real estate listing. Mine had a lunch at home every morning because the sandwiches near the office were $12, and he wasn't that guy anymore. He hadn't been that guy in a long time. He had a good babysitter, though. Mrs. Okonkwo from the 3rd floor, who charged him $40 less than the going rate because she loved Emma and because she'd met Damon's wife once, years ago, at a building party. And she'd never said why that mattered, but it clearly did. The Hargrove Logistics building was a 14-story glass tower in the financial district, the kind of building that tried to look more impressive than it was by using a lot of reflective surfaces. The lobby had a security desk and a motivational quote painted on one wall in oversized sans serif type, "Efficiency is the highest form of excellence." Damon had walked past it 5 days a week for nearly 3 years, and he had never once found it motivating. His department, Supply Chain Data and Analysis, occupied most of the 9th floor. 12 analysts, 2 senior analysts, 1 deputy director who mostly forwarded emails, and then above all of them, Craig Whitmore, director of logistics operations. Craig Whitmore was 51 years old, had an MBA from a school he mentioned constantly, and was the kind of manager who interpreted every question as a challenge to his authority. He was broad-shouldered in the way of a man who'd played football in college and hadn't quite updated his self-image since. He wore his suits a size too tight, which might have been intentional, and he laughed loudly at his own observations and waited for the room to catch up. He'd been director for 4 years. In those 4 years, 3 analysts had quietly transferred to other departments. 1 had gone on extended stress leave and never come back, and the general atmosphere on the ninth floor had the particular quality of air in a room where people had learned not to speak freely. Damon had managed to stay mostly below Craig's radar by being competent without being threatening. He did his work, he did it well, he didn't ask for recognition, and he went home. It wasn't the career he'd imagined having at 37, but it was the one he had. That Thursday evening, most of the ninth floor had already emptied out by 7:30. The rain had driven the early commuters home fast, and the usual crowd of people who stayed late to be seen staying late had apparently decided their devotion had limits. Damon was finishing a traffic pattern analysis that was due Friday morning, the kind of tedious spreadsheet work that required just enough attention to keep him from thinking about other things. He heard the voice before he registered the words. Craig Whitmore's voice carried naturally. He projected, whether he meant to or not, the residual habit of someone who'd spent years assuming rooms were his. But there was something in the pitch of it tonight that made Damon glance up from his screen. The sound was coming from the corridor near the main elevator bank, just past the glass partition that separated the open floor plan from the hallway. He stood. Not dramatically, just stood, the way his body sometimes made decisions slightly ahead of his brain. He walked to the partition and looked through. An elderly woman in a gray cleaning uniform was crouched on the floor near the elevator doors, pressing paper towels into a spreading puddle of coffee. The mug lay on its side against the baseboard, a cheap ceramic thing with the Hargrove logo on it. She was moving carefully, methodically, the way older people move when they're aware of every joint. Her cart was positioned to one side, yellow caution sign already out. Craig Whitmore stood over her. Not beside her. Over her. Feet planted, arms crossed, looking down at the woman with an expression that Damon recognized from places a lot worse than corporate hallways. The expression of a person who had decided, in some fundamental way, that the person in front of them didn't fully count. I've told facilities 3 times, Craig was saying. 3 times. That the cleaning shift shouldn't be running when staff are still present. This is exactly, he gestured at the spill. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. The woman said something quiet that Damon couldn't make out. An apology. Her English had an accent, Eastern European maybe, or Russian. I don't need an explanation, Craig said, and the dismissiveness in his voice was so complete it was almost architectural. What I need is to not have to watch where I step in my own office because someone can't manage a coffee cup. I am sorry, sir, the woman said, louder this time. It was accident. Everything's an accident with you people. He said it flatly, like it wasn't even an insult, just an observation he'd gotten tired of making. Just hurry up and get it cleaned, and try not to leave water streaks on the floor again. Last week the whole hallway looked like someone mopped it with a dirty shirt. The woman kept her head down. She kept pressing the paper towels into the spill. Craig turned to leave. Damon was already pushing through the partition door. What? Later, he wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what thought process led to the next 30 seconds. There wasn't one precisely. It was more like something he'd been holding in a closed hand for a very long time, and his hand had simply opened. Hey! Craig stopped, turned. The surprise on his face lasted about half a second before it became something else. The slight narrowing of someone recalibrating. Cross. He said it the way you'd say a word you weren't sure was spelled right. What are you still doing here? Finishing the southeastern grid analysis, Damon stepped into the hallway. The woman had looked up from the floor, not startled, more like someone bracing. You were just talking to her pretty rough. A beat of silence. Craig tilted his head slightly. I'm sorry? The woman. Damon glanced at her briefly. Older than he'd thought from across the floor, mid-60s maybe, fine lines around her eyes, a tiredness in them that had nothing to do with tonight. She spilled some coffee. It happens. Craig's expression completed its recalibration. There was a kind of slow, disbelieving amusement there now, the way someone looks when they're trying to decide if what they're experiencing is actually happening. Are you seriously? He laughed, short and incredulous. Are you seriously involving yourself in this right now? I heard how you talked to her. She's the cleaning staff, Cross. He said it without any particular heat, which somehow made it worse, like it was simply a fact that settled the matter. She knocked a full mug of coffee onto the floor of a client corridor. This isn't a thing. She apologized. Damon kept his voice level. He wasn't raising it. He didn't need to. She's doing her job. You don't talk to people like that. Something shifted in Craig's face. The amusement didn't disappear, but it got harder underneath. I'm going to suggest, Craig said, measuring each word, that you go back to your desk and finish whatever you were doing, and I'm going to suggest that strongly. And I'm going to suggest, Damon said, that you think about whether you want your exact words going into a formal complaint to HR, because I've got a pretty good memory. The hallway was quiet, except for the faint hum of the elevator machinery somewhere above them, and the soft sounds of the woman finishing with the spill. She had gotten to her feet now. She was watching both of them with an expression Damon couldn't fully read. Not quite fear, not quite hope. Something in between. Craig looked at Damon for a long moment. His jaw was tight. He was the kind of man who didn't like being disagreed with in front of an audience, even an audience of one elderly woman. Go home, Cross, he said finally, quietly, with the particular softness of someone storing something away for later. This conversation is over. He turned and walked toward his office. His footsteps were controlled. He didn't slam anything. Damon stood where he was. After a moment, the woman touched his arm lightly. He looked at her. She had a kind face. Not soft, exactly, but kind. Weathered in the way of someone who'd been through things and hadn't let those things make her bitter, or at least was working hard at that. You shouldn't do that, she said quietly. For me. You don't have to. I know, he said. You could have trouble. Yeah, he paused. How long have you worked here? She seemed briefly surprised by the question. 3 weeks, part-time. Do you need help with the cart? She blinked. Then very faintly, she almost smiled. No, I have it. She paused. Thank you, you are a kind man. Damon shrugged slightly, the way he did when he didn't know how to take a compliment anymore. Have a safe night. He turned and went back to his desk. He finished the analysis by 8:45. He collected his bag, rode the elevator down, walked back out into the rain. The email came at 6:12 the next morning, before Emma was awake, while Damon was standing at the kitchen counter eating toast over the sink because he hadn't gotten around to buying a plate that matched anything else. It was from HR. Formal notice of employment termination. Standard language, dense and impersonal. The bullet points were almost comforting in their clinical clarity. Conduct unbecoming, disruption of management authority, failure to maintain professional workplace standards. There was a sentence about collecting his personal effects between 9 and 11 a.m. on Friday, with a security escort available upon request. He read it twice. Then he set his phone down on the counter and looked out the small kitchen window at the gray morning beginning to assemble itself over the parking lot. He thought about the $900 a month. He thought about the specialist appointment in 6 weeks that Emma didn't know had been scheduled. He thought about the credit card balance and the lease and Mrs. Okonkwo, who was probably already on her way down from the 3rd floor. He thought about the woman's face in the hallway, the way she'd looked at him, briefly, with something that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it. He stood there for a minute, maybe 2. Then he heard Emma's feet on the floor in the other room, that particular uneven rhythm she had in the morning, still half asleep, and he put the phone in his pocket, turned to the cabinet, and took out the cereal. Whatever came next could wait until she was at school. Right now, she needed breakfast, and he needed to figure out what to tell her about the next few weeks, and probably he needed to find a story that didn't sound like what it actually was. He was good at that. He had practice. But standing there, listening to Emma pad toward him down the short hallway, something in his chest that had been clenched for a long time had loosened very slightly. Not because things were better, they were considerably worse, but because for the first time in months he'd done something that was purely, straightforwardly right, without calculating the cost first. The cost had turned out to be everything he had, and he couldn't honestly say he'd make a different choice. He didn't know yet what that meant. He didn't know a lot of things. He poured the cereal, and he waited for his daughter, and outside the window the gray morning kept building itself, indifferent and slow. Emma ate her cereal slowly, the way she always did when she was thinking about something she wasn't ready to say yet. She was 8, but she had the particular stillness of a kid who'd learned early that the world wasn't always going to explain itself to you, so you might as well pay attention to it. Damon sat across from her with a cup of coffee he wasn't really drinking. He watched her spoon circles through the milk. The rain from last night had stopped somewhere around 3 in the morning, and the kitchen window now showed a pale, washed-out Friday, that couldn't seem to decide what kind of day it wanted to be. "You're not eating," Emma said, without looking up. "I ate earlier." She looked up. "The toast over the sink doesn't count." He stared at her. "How do you know about that?" "I could hear it." She tapped her spoon on the edge of the bowl. "You crunch when you eat toast. You always crunch." He didn't have an answer for that, so he picked up his coffee and drank some of it. It had gone lukewarm. He drank it anyway. "Dad." "Yeah." "Is something wrong?" He looked at her. At those eyes, her mother's eyes, that saw things before he was ready for them to be seen. He had approximately 90 seconds before she moved from curious to worried, and once she moved to worried, her breathing would tighten, and once her breathing tightened, the whole morning would pivot into something else entirely. "I've got some stuff to figure out at work," he said. "Nothing major, just logistics." He almost smiled at himself for the word. "You know how it is." "I don't know how it is," she said. "I'm 8. "Fair point." She considered him for another moment, then went back to her cereal. She was like that. She'd give you a window, and if you didn't climb through it, she'd close it, not in a punishing way, just in the way of a kid who'd learned to hold her own hand. That part was the hardest. The part that was entirely his fault, and entirely not his fault at the same time. Mrs. Okonkwo came at 7:50, slightly damp from the elevator lobby, where the ceiling had been leaking since November. She had Emma's school bag already checked. She did that without being asked, just appeared at the door with the bag inventoried, and Emma's inhaler confirmed inside the front pocket. Damon had tried to thank her for that once, specifically, and she'd looked at him with mild impatience, like he'd tried to thank her for breathing. "You look tired," she said to him at the door, while Emma went back for her library book. "I'm fine." "That is not what I asked." She studied him briefly with the directness of a woman who'd raised 4 children and wasn't interested in protecting anyone from a simple question. "Is Emma okay?" "Emma's good. It's something at work. I'll handle it." She looked at him for one more second. Then she nodded once and went back inside to collect Emma. He stood in the doorway and watched the two of them head down the hall, Emma explaining something about her library book with the particular intensity she reserved for topics she cared about. Mrs. Okonkwo listening with full attention, like it was the most important thing she'd heard all week. The elevator doors closed on them. Damon went back inside. He sat down at the kitchen table. He opened his laptop, pulled up the email again, read it a third time as if the words might have rearranged themselves while he wasn't looking. They hadn't. He closed the laptop and opened a job board instead. By noon, he had submitted 6 applications. 3 were long shots, positions that wanted 5 to 8 years of logistics management experience, which he had in a parallel universe where his resume told the full story of what he'd actually done in his career, which it couldn't. 2 were lateral moves to similar analyst roles at companies that, based on their Glassdoor reviews, had cultures that sounded only marginally better than Hargrove. 1 was a step down, a data entry coordinator position at a freight brokerage in the industrial part of town, and he applied to it without pausing because stepping down was still employment, and employment was still health coverage, and health coverage was still Emma's lungs. He went into the Hargrove building at 9:30 with his own reusable bag, which struck him, in the elevator, as a deeply strange detail, that the end of nearly 3 years of his working life would be carried home in a bag he'd originally bought for groceries. The security escort turned out to be a young guy named Marcus, who Damon had talked to a handful of times in the lobby, who looked genuinely uncomfortable with the assignment and apologized twice without being asked. Damon told him it was fine and meant it. It wasn't Marcus's problem. His desk took about 7 minutes to clear. That was the thing about keeping your space sparse. It was efficient in the wrong direction, too. A framed photo of Emma at 6, at the beach, squinting into the sun with a mouthful of missing teeth. A small notebook he used for hand calculations because he thought better on paper. A spare inhaler he kept at work as backup, which he slipped into his jacket pocket with the quick, practiced motion of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. He didn't look at Craig Whitmore's office on the way out. Not because he was managing his emotions about it. He genuinely didn't care enough to look. Marcus walked him to the elevator. "I'm sorry, man," he said again at the doors. I don't know. I've been here 2 years, and some of the stuff I've seen, I'm sorry." "Don't be." Damon shook his hand. "Take care of yourself." He rode down alone, walked out through the lobby past the efficiency quote, stepped into the pale Friday afternoon. He sat in his car in the parking garage for a while. Not a long while. 5 minutes, maybe. He wasn't the kind of person who needed to be still for long. What he needed was a problem he could act on, and right now the problems were multiple and large, and most of them didn't have immediate actionable solutions. So he sat with that for 5 minutes, which was about as much tolerance for inaction as he generally had. And then he drove home. He didn't tell Emma. That was the decision he made, and he knew it was both the right one and the wrong one simultaneously, which was how a lot of his decisions felt these days. What he told her that evening, over the spaghetti he made because it was her favorite and because he needed something to do with his hands. I'm between jobs for a little bit. I'm figuring out the next thing. She twirled spaghetti around her fork with the focus of a watchmaker. Did they fire you? He considered lying. Yeah. Because of something bad you did? Depends on who you ask. She thought about this with the same focused expression. What do you think? I think I did something right. Right, he said. And it cost me the job. She looked up. Does that mean we're going to have to move? He felt the question land the way questions from her always did. Square in the chest, no buffer. No, he said. We're not moving. I'm going to find something. It's just going to take a little time. How much time? I'm working on making it short. She studied him. Okay, she said. Not dramatically. Not with the reassurance that everything was fine, just okay. Like she was filing the information and reserving judgment until she had more data. She was, in some ways, the most emotionally intelligent person he knew, and she was 8 years old, and he didn't know whether to be proud of that or gutted by it. Probably both. It was probably both. What he did not know, what he had no particular reason to know, was that 37 blocks north of his apartment, in the 22nd floor of a building that didn't have its company name on the exterior because it didn't need to, a woman named Serena Ashford was sitting at a desk that cost more than his car and reading a report about him. The report was 12 pages. It had been compiled by a private intelligence firm she retained for exactly this kind of situation, which said something about the kind of life she led, though she'd stopped thinking about it in those terms. The firm was thorough. They were paid to be thorough. And so the report included his full employment history, a redacted summary of his military service record, his current financial situation, including the debt he was privately ashamed of, the cost of his daughter's medical treatments, the custody arrangement that was not an arrangement at all because there was no other parent, and a timeline of the events of the previous evening reconstructed from security camera footage and building access logs. She read through it carefully, which was how she read everything. She had the kind of focus that made people in meetings slightly uncomfortable, not because she was intimidating exactly, though she was, but because you could tell when she was reading something that she was actually reading it, all of it, and retaining it. Serena Ashford was 30 years old. She looked younger than that, which she'd learned to use as a tool when it was useful and otherwise mostly ignored. She'd started her first company at 22, a logistics software platform she'd built with two friends in an apartment that had bad heat and a landlord who preferred not to be called about it. That company had been acquired. She'd started the next one at 25, Ashford Logistics Systems. Though the name didn't appear on the building, the fleet trucks were unmarked, and most of the industry didn't know it was hers, which was by design, had grown from a regional freight management operation into a company with 17,000 employees across 9 states, handling supply chains for some of the largest retailers in the country. She'd gotten there by being smarter than most people in the room, by working hours that her doctor had twice suggested reconsidering, and by caring with an almost unreasonable intensity about whether the thing she was building was actually good to work for, good to do business with, good in some concrete sense that went beyond quarterly numbers. The numbers she could always make work. The culture was the thing you couldn't retrofit once you'd lost it, and she'd watched other companies lose it and spend years pretending they hadn't, which was why, 8 weeks ago, when she'd started noticing patterns in the internal reporting from certain regional divisions, numbers that were technically clean but felt wrong, survey data that read like it had been massaged, turnover rates that no one seemed to be accounting for, she had done something that her board would have had thoughts about if they'd known, which they didn't. She had gone undercover. Not in any dramatic sense. She'd arranged with a contract cleaning service to place her on a rotation at 3 of her own regional facilities and 2 satellite offices under a different name on the roster, M. Van Eck, which was her grandmother's maiden name, which felt right in a way she couldn't fully explain. She'd spent the previous 3 weeks doing exactly what the role required: cleaning offices, mopping corridors, emptying wastebaskets, and being invisibly present in the spaces where the real culture of a company lived. Not in the presentations, not in the all-hands meetings, in the hallways, in the break rooms, in the moments when people thought no one was watching. She'd seen things that made her tired in a way that went deeper than physical. The casual condescension, the small performances of power, the precise, almost surgical ways that certain managers made sure the people below them felt small. She'd watched employees who were clearly good at their jobs flinch when a director walked past, and she'd understood, in a way that slides and reports could never communicate, what that flinch cost. Not just the individual, but the company, in every slow decision and withheld idea and quietly submitted resignation that followed from it. She'd compiled evidence. That was the other part of it. She hadn't gone in just to feel what the culture felt like. She'd gone in because she'd suspected, specifically, that certain executives were falsifying operational reports to hide failures that were being papered over with accounting maneuvers, and she'd needed to be present to find the threads. She'd found them. In overheard conversations, in the names of people mentioned in the wrong context, in the particular body language of a regional director who was too comfortable talking about numbers that didn't add up, in the hearing of a woman he believed had no idea what he was talking about. Craig Whitmore was not the largest problem in her portfolio. He was not the most sophisticated fraudster she'd uncovered in the past 8 weeks. But he was the most casually cruel, which in some ways she found more dispiriting than the fraud, because fraud at least required a kind of effort. She'd been in his building 3 weeks. She'd seen how he operated, the performed authority, the contempt for anyone he calculated was beneath him, the way he could shift into perfectly reasonable manager language the moment someone with power walked into the room. She'd built the picture. She had what she needed. And then, last night, a man she'd never seen before had walked out of a partition door in a half-empty office at 7:30 in the evening, in the rain, with no audience worth speaking of, and told Craig Whitmore to his face that he didn't talk to people that way. She'd been on her knees cleaning up the coffee she had actually, genuinely dropped. She was tired. It had been a long 3 weeks. Her coordination at the end of a double shift was not what it was at the start. And she'd looked up and seen this man, tall, with the specific kind of stillness that wasn't passive, standing between her and Whitmore, with his voice completely level and his hands loose at his sides, like someone who'd made a decision and was simply standing inside it. She'd known immediately, from the way he held himself, that he had military in his background. Not the performed version, the actual version, the kind where the body has been trained so thoroughly that it defaults, under pressure, to a kind of clarity. She'd grown up around military people, her uncle, 2 cousins, and she recognized the posture not as aggression, but as its opposite. As someone who'd learned the real cost of escalation and was therefore not afraid of it, he'd defended her. And then when she'd tried to thank him, he'd asked if she needed help with the cart. She'd thought about that afterward, the sequence of it, the way it hadn't been a grand gesture. It had been 2 things, the intervention and then the cart. The second part was almost more telling than the first. The first could have been ego or anger or just a bad day expressing itself in an available direction. The second was just attention, care without theater. She'd gone home that night and sat with it for a while before she called the firm. Now she closed the report and looked out at the gray morning over the city. The file had given her a picture, but pictures from a file had a flat quality, a compression of life into facts that she'd learned to mistrust. She trusted what she'd seen in the hallway more than she trusted the 12 pages. She'd built her whole company on that instinct, on watching how people behaved when they thought it didn't count, and understanding that that was when it counted most. She picked up her phone and called her head of HR and security coordination. "I need 2 things," she said when he picked up. "The full internal audit on the Whitmore division needs to be ready for a board-level presentation by Wednesday. Everything we have," she paused. "And I want to set up a meeting with a former Hargrove employee named Damon Cross. Don't make it sound like a legal summons. Just extend an invitation. Headquarters. Tell him it's regarding the Hargrove operational review." She thought briefly. "Give him 2 days' notice. I want him to have time to think about it, not feel ambushed." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Should I give him a reason to expect the meeting to go well?" "No," she said. "Don't give him any particular impression at all. Just invite him." She paused once more. and pull his daughter's medical file references from the HR records. I want to know exactly what the health coverage gap is going to look like. She hung up. She sat back. Outside, the gray was finally beginning to break, thin light pushing through from somewhere that had been patient about it. She didn't think of herself as someone who rescued people. She'd been helped, here and there, at moments that mattered, and she'd paid that forward in ways that were sometimes visible and more often weren't, but it wasn't a self-concept she operated out of. What she operated out of was a bone-deep belief that the world, or at least her corner of it, ran on people, and that most institutions did a catastrophically poor job of recognizing which people actually held things together. She'd been watching hundreds of employees for 8 weeks. She'd watched them calculate the cost of speaking up and decide the math didn't work. She understood the math. She wasn't naive about it. She'd done versions of that math herself, early on, in rooms where speaking up had consequences she couldn't afford. She just wanted to understand why, for Damon Cross, the math had worked differently. The 2 days felt longer to Damon than they probably should have. He applied for 11 more positions. He heard back from 2. One an automated rejection, one a request for a phone screen that he completed standing in his kitchen while Emma was at school, pacing from the table to the window and back while he answered questions about his experience with supply chain management software in the tone of someone who was not currently worried about very much. He was rejected from that one too, 2 days later, in an email that said they'd decided to move forward with another candidate who more closely matched their current needs, which was the sentence companies used when they wanted to say something that ended the conversation without actually saying it. He called the pulmonologist's office and moved Emma's appointment out 6 weeks, explaining that he was between insurance plans. The woman on the phone was kind about it in a way that made it worse, not better. He cooked dinner every night that week. He helped Emma with her reading assignment about migratory birds, and he was more engaged with it than he would have been on a normal week, because he had more time, and also because the alternative was sitting alone with his thoughts about the credit card balance. Emma explained to him, at some length, that the blackpoll warbler flew from Alaska to South America without stopping, which she found remarkable and slightly ridiculous, and he found he agreed with her. "That seems like a lot," she said. "It does," he said. "Why don't they just stop somewhere in the middle?" "I don't know," he said. "I think maybe the middle doesn't have what they need." She accepted this with the equanimity she brought to most information and went back to her worksheet. I was good at compartmentalization. It was a skill he'd had long before the Navy had put a name to it. But there were limits to it, and at night, when the apartment was quiet and Emma was asleep, he'd sit at the kitchen table with his laptop and the job boards, and he'd feel the weight of it settling in a way he didn't let it during the day. 3 weeks, he told himself. He'd give it 3 weeks of real, full-contact job searching before he reconsidered the plan. After 3 weeks, he'd look at liquidating the savings account. After that, there were options he didn't want to think about yet. Calling his former commanding officer who'd offered, twice, to connect him to private security work. He wasn't sure he wanted. Applying to logistics roles that would require relocating, asking his sister in Raleigh for a loan she could afford, but that he wouldn't be able to look her in the eye about afterward. He didn't sleep well. He never had, not really. Not since before his wife died, and certainly not after. And the particular insomnia of financial stress had its own texture, not the adrenaline insomnia from operational years or the grief insomnia of the worst months after. This was a quieter, more grinding kind of wakefulness, the kind that mostly just involved lying in the dark and running numbers that didn't come out right. He was in the middle of this on the second night after the termination when his phone buzzed with an email he almost didn't open. The subject line was, "Ashford Logistics Systems, Operational Review Meeting Request." He read it sitting up in bed, in the dark, with the screen light too bright. It was brief, professionally worded, extended an invitation to meet at their headquarters at his convenience within the next week, mentioned the Hargrove Logistics connection as context without explaining it further, and was signed by someone named Kay Adebayo, head of talent and organizational development. Damon read it twice. He didn't know Ashford Logistics. He looked it up from his phone, squinting at the screen. A privately held logistics company. No Wikipedia page. Minimal public web presence. But the trade publications that mentioned it in passing used the phrase fastest growing often enough that it felt like something more than PR language. He had no idea why they were inviting him to a meeting. The email was careful not to indicate whether this was a job discussion or something else, and that careful vagueness was either legal covering or something more deliberate, and he couldn't tell which. He wrote back, "Thank you for the invitation. I'm available this week. Wednesday afternoon works well if that suits your schedule." He sent it before he talked himself out of it, put the phone face down on the nightstand, and lay back down. He didn't sleep for another hour. He was not the kind of man who believed things happened for reasons. He'd seen too much of the world's actual mechanics to find that comfortable. But he was also not a man who wasted time on the question. Something had opened. He didn't know what was behind it. He'd walk through it and find out, and then he'd make whatever decision the situation actually called for. That was how he'd operated for 20 years. There was no particular reason to stop now. Wednesday came with weak sun, thin and unconvincing, the kind of morning that makes no promises. He ironed his shirt the night before. Emma noticed in the morning and said he looked different, and he said he had a meeting, and she said what kind, and he said the important kind. And she looked at him for a moment with those eyes that saw things, and then she said quietly, "Okay, Dad. Good luck." Like she knew it mattered and wanted to say so without making it bigger than he could carry right now. He drove downtown with the radio off. He found the building on Vance Street, unremarkable exterior, no logo, and rode the elevator to the 22nd floor and straightened his jacket and walked through the glass doors into a reception area that was quiet and clean and organized in the way of a place that functioned without needing to announce it. He gave his name, he sat down, he waited. He didn't know he was about to walk into a room that would change the shape of his life. He was just a man who'd done the right thing in a hallway at 7:30 in the evening, who had no job and a sick daughter and a credit card balance that kept him awake, sitting in someone else's clean lobby with his hands resting loose on his knees. He'd been in harder waiting rooms. He'd waited in worse silences. He breathed steadily, and he waited, and the city moved below the windows, indifferent as cities always are, and eventually the receptionist looked up and said his name, and he stood. The receptionist led him down a corridor that was quiet in the specific way of places where real work happened, not the performative quiet of a law firm or the artificial hush of a bank, but the focused silence of people who were concentrating on something that mattered. The carpet was plain. The walls had no motivational quotes. Damon noticed both things and filed them without quite knowing why. She stopped at a set of double doors at the end of the hall and told him someone would be with him in a moment, and then she left him there, which he hadn't expected. He'd assumed there'd be a waiting room, a conference room, some antechamber to the actual thing. Instead, the doors were already open a few inches, and he could hear voices inside, not arguing, but the compressed, clipped cadence of people who were in the middle of something and not quite finished. He stood in the corridor and waited. He could hear enough to know there were at least 3 people in the room. He could hear Craig Whitmore's voice. That landed differently than he'd anticipated. Not fear. He hadn't been afraid of Craig Whitmore in the hallway, and he wasn't now. But a kind of alertness, the body recalibrating to information the mind was still processing. He hadn't known Craig would be here. He didn't know what that meant yet. He breathed once, steadily, and when a woman in a dark blazer appeared at the door and said, "Mr. Cross, please come in," he walked through. The boardroom was large without being showy. A long oval table, high windows that looked out over the city, chairs that were expensive in the understated way of things, bought by people who didn't need to prove anything with furniture. 8 people around the table, maybe 9. Damon scanned the room the way he always scanned rooms, quickly and without making it obvious, and identified the arrangements of power. Who sat at the head, who sat closest to them, who sat with their chair angled slightly away from the table because they were either skeptical or nervous. Craig Whitmore sat near the far end of the table, to the left of the head chair, which was empty. I was in a suit Damon hadn't seen before, newer than the ones he wore at Hargrove, and he was leaning back in his chair with the particular body language of a man who believed he understood the situation. When he saw Damon walk in, something moved across his face. Surprise, then a quick calculation, then an expression that settled into the controlled version of contempt he defaulted to when he wanted people to know their place without having to say it explicitly. Cross. He said it the same way he always said it, like the word was slightly smaller than it deserved to be. Damon looked at him without expression. "Craig?" A few of the other people in the room glanced between them. Nobody explained anything. There were 2 people Damon didn't recognize sitting adjacent to Craig. a man in his 50s with the look of a corporate attorney, and a younger woman with a legal pad who was writing something and didn't look up when Damon entered. Across the table were four others who had the specific quality of people who had been brought in to observe rather than participate. Board members, maybe. Or auditors. Damon couldn't tell. He was offered a seat near the middle of the table, which he took. The chair at the head remained empty. He didn't ask about it. Craig filled the silence the way Craig always filled silences, by expanding into them. "I'll be honest," he said, to the room at large but angled toward Damon. "I'm not entirely sure what the agenda is here, but I've been told this is about the operational review of the Hargrove division, and I'm happy to speak to anything in that review, because my record is—" He paused, letting the pause carry what the words couldn't. "Clean." Nobody responded to that. The corporate attorney was looking at something on his phone. The woman with the legal pad kept writing. "Mr. Cross," said one of the observers, a man with silver hair and a measured voice that suggested he'd spent a long time learning how to sound like the calmest person in the room. "Thank you for coming in. We appreciate your time." "Of course," Damon said. "We have some questions about your time at Hargrove Logistics and about the circumstances of your departure." "I can answer those." Craig shifted in his chair. "I'd like to note for the record that this man was terminated for cause. Whatever he tells you about his departure, the documented reason is conduct unbecoming and disruption of management authority." "We're aware of the termination documentation," the silver-haired man said mildly. "Then I'm not sure why he's here." "He's here because we invited him." Craig's jaw tightened slightly. He recalibrated again. Damon could watch him do it. The slight relaxation of the shoulders that was meant to look like confidence. The way he repositioned his hands on the table. He was good at that. The reinflation. Damon had known men like this in other contexts, in other rooms, and the reinflation was always the tell. It meant the man had learned to manage situations with presentation rather than with substance, and he'd gotten good enough at it that he'd started to believe the presentation was the substance. The silver-haired man was about to say something else when the door behind Damon opened. He didn't turn immediately. He heard footsteps, unhurried even. And then he heard Craig say something under his breath that wasn't quite audible but had the shape of surprise in it, and Damon turned. The woman who walked through the door was not, in any obvious way, remarkable. She was young, younger than Damon had expected for whatever role she occupied here. And she was dressed plainly, in dark slacks and a gray jacket that fit well without announcing itself. Her hair was pulled back. She had no jewelry except a watch. She walked to the head of the table without hesitating or looking around for the chair, the way someone walks to a seat they've occupied 1,000 times. It took Damon 4 seconds. The face was different without the fatigue, without the cleaning uniform, without the particular posture of someone making themselves smaller to fit an expected shape. The eyes were the same. He'd looked into those eyes in the hallway, briefly, when she'd touched his arm and said, "You don't have to." He'd looked into them again when she'd almost smiled. He knew her. And he suddenly understood, with the comprehensive clarity of information snapping into place, several things at once. Why the invitation had been vague, why Craig Whitmore was in this room, why the chair at the head of the table had been empty. He kept his face still. It wasn't hard. He'd had practice. She sat. She set a single manila folder on the table in front of her, closed, and folded her hands on top of it. She looked around the room with the unhurried attention of someone who had learned that the person who controlled the pace controlled the room. Her gaze moved across the board members, the attorneys, and then settled briefly on Damon with an expression that was professional and gave nothing away. Then it moved to Craig. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Her voice was clear and even. "Thank you for being here." Craig had recovered himself. The surprise had been absorbed and repackaged. "Of course. I was glad to come in for the operational review. My division's numbers are—" "We'll get to the division numbers," she said. Not cutting him off, exactly. Just closing that door with quiet efficiency. She introduced herself to the room. Serena Ashford, founder and CEO of Ashford Logistics Systems. And the slight stiffening around the table told Damon that at least 2 or 3 people in the room had not known, until this moment, who they were sitting across from. Craig's expression went through something complicated that he recovered from too slowly to fully hide. "I want to start," Serena said, "with something a little unusual, Mr. Cross." She looked at Damon directly. I'd like to ask you a question, and I'd like you to answer it honestly, even though the context will be somewhat clearer by the end of this meeting than it is right now. All right, Damon said. On the evening of your termination, the previous Thursday, you intervened in a situation in the ninth floor corridor of the Hargrove building. Can you describe what happened, from your perspective? The room was very quiet. Craig had gone perfectly still in the way of someone who has just understood they are not in the position they thought they were in and is working very hard not to show it. Damon described it. He kept it factual, what he heard, what he saw, what he said. He didn't editorialize. He didn't describe Craig's tone in pointed language or frame his own actions as particularly noble. He just said what happened, in the order it happened, the way he would have written an after-action report. When he finished, the silver-haired man said, "And you were terminated the following morning?" "The email came at 6:12 a.m., Damon said. "Yeah." Craig leaned forward. "I want to be very clear that the termination was fully within my authority as Mr. Whitmore." Serena said it quietly, and Craig stopped. There was something in her voice that wasn't volume or sharpness. It was something else, a quality of absolute certainty that made raising a contrary voice feel like a structural problem rather than just a social one. She waited half a beat to make sure the stop had taken. Then she opened the manila folder. She didn't make a production of it. She slid a document to the silver-haired man first, then indicated the attorney, who distributed copies to the others. Damon received one. He looked at it. A summary document, dense with figures, dates, names, and cross-referenced internal references he could follow only partially. But he could follow enough. "What you're looking at," Serena said to the room, "is a condensed version of a 16-week internal investigation into the operational and financial practices of 5 regional divisions of Ashford Logistics Systems. 3 of those divisions were under direct management oversight, connected to executives who were placed at Hargrove Logistics on contract arrangements over the past 3 years." She paused. "I'll let the document speak for itself on the specifics, but in summary, we have evidence of falsified operational efficiency reports, misappropriated vendor contract margins totaling approximately $2.3 million over an 18-month period, systematic suppression of employee grievance documentation, and a pattern of retaliatory terminations designed to remove staff who had either discovered or were likely to discover the discrepancies." The room absorbed this. Damon looked at the figures on his copy of the document. I was good with numbers. It was the whole job. And the numbers told a story that was not subtle once you knew how to read it. Craig's attorney said something in a low voice. Craig appeared to not be listening. He was staring at the document with the expression of a man who has just felt the ground change underneath him and is still waiting to find out how far it goes. "I want to be clear," Craig said, and his voice had changed, still controlled, but with a new quality in it now, the slight thinness of air at altitude. "Whatever this document is alleging, I was not involved in any financial—" "Your name appears on 17 of the vendor authorization signatures," Serena said. She said it the way you'd correct a factual error, without enjoyment, without unnecessary force. "Those authorizations were standard procedure. I signed dozens of—" "The authorizations correspond to vendors that do not appear in any procurement database, do not have verifiable business registrations, and were paid a combined total of $840,000 over 14 months. She looked at him steadily. "The money did not go to vendors, Mr. Whitmore." Silence. Craig's attorney put a hand on his arm. Craig appeared to not feel it. He was looking at Serena with an expression that had finally dropped all of its layers. Not because he'd chosen to be honest, but because the machinery of presentation had stopped working and there was nothing behind it to replace it with. What was left was something rawer and smaller. A man realizing that the room he thought he was running was, and had been for some time, entirely someone else's. "You were the cleaner," he said. He said it slowly, like a man waking up partway through a dream and trying to locate himself. "In the hallway. That was you." Serena didn't confirm or deny it. She simply held his gaze. "You set me up," he said. "I investigated my own company," she said. "You provided the evidence." His jaw moved. He looked for a moment as if he was going to say something else, something sharp, something that reframed this in a way that gave him back some portion of what he'd just lost. The attorney tightened his hand on Craig's arm. Craig closed his mouth. What happened next took about 12 minutes and was mostly logistical. The silver-haired man, who turned out to be Ashford's general counsel, outlined the legal exposure and the terms of the separation agreement, which included a non-disparagement clause, a full cooperation requirement with the forensic audit, and the notation that the findings had already been forwarded to the relevant regulatory authorities. Two people from an internal security team appeared at the door, not dramatically, just present, and Craig was informed that they would escort him out of the building after he'd had 10 minutes to confer with his attorney. Damon watched all of this with the particular quality of attention he used when he needed to understand a situation without participating in it. He watched Craig go through the stages of it, the resistance, the calculation of whether resistance was worth the cost, the eventual compression into something quieter and more defeated. I didn't feel satisfaction about it exactly. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was more like watching physics, because moving through its sequence to effect, with the impersonal logic of things that were always going to land where they landed. When Craig stood to leave, he glanced at Damon, just once, briefly. His expression was unreadable in the specific way of faces trying to conceal too many things at once. He didn't say anything. Damon met his eyes for a moment and then looked away, not dismissively, just finished. Whatever that had been, it was finished. The door closed behind Craig and his attorney and the two security people, and the remaining room seemed to exhale slightly. Serena looked at the board members and attorneys. "I'll need 10 minutes with Mr. Cross. We can reconvene for the governance discussion at 2. People gathered their documents and filed out with the efficient, practiced movement of people accustomed to being organized, and then it was just the two of them in the large room, with the city outside the windows moving in its usual indifferent way, and the quiet between them had a different texture than any of the quiet before it. She was quiet for a moment. Damon waited. He was good at waiting. Then she reached into the folder and placed something on the table between them. He looked at it. A $20 bill, slightly crumpled, pressed flat. He recognized it the way you recognize things you didn't know you'd remember. He'd taken it out of his wallet in the parking garage that Thursday night, before he'd even processed the full weight of what had just happened, and pressed it into the old woman's hand. He'd said something like, "For a cab, if you need it," and she'd looked at him with an expression he still couldn't fully characterize. He hadn't thought about it again. He had enough other things to think about. "You'd just been terminated," Serena said. "Yeah." "You gave it to me anyway." He looked at the 20. "You were alone in a parking garage at night. I didn't know how far you were going." "You didn't know anything about me." "No," he said. "That wasn't really the point." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in her expression that was harder to read than the boardroom had been. Not guarded exactly, but careful. The expression of someone who had learned to weigh what they trusted and wasn't sure yet where this conversation fell. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You don't," he said. "But I'll listen if you want to give one," she told him. Not everything, not in a linear start-to-finish way, but enough. The investigation, the undercover placement, what she'd been looking for and what she'd found. She told him she'd been watching employees for weeks and had seen things that depressed her in a structural way. Not because people were cowardly, but because the incentives were built wrong. And when the incentives are built wrong, the only people who don't adjust their behavior accordingly are either reckless or naive. "Or principled," Damon said. She looked at him. "Those aren't always different things." "No," he said. "They're not." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cloud moved and the thin November sun came through the windows at a different angle, briefly making the room warmer than it was. She looked, in that light, younger, not in a way that seemed naive, but in a way that reminded him there was a lot of weight for 30 years of a person to carry. "How's your daughter?" she asked. He stilled. It was a small thing, but it landed. "You know about Emma?" "I had a report prepared. I told you. I take investigations seriously." She said it without apology, but also without pretension. "Her name is Emma. She has severe asthma. Her medical costs are significant. The health coverage from Hargrove was the primary reason you stayed in a job that wasn't using you." He sat with that for a moment. Being seen clearly by someone you'd barely met was its own specific discomfort, not unpleasant exactly, but unfamiliar, like stepping into a room with better light than you expected. "She's okay," he said. "She's managing." "That's a word I imagine you use a lot." He almost smiled. "It covers a lot of ground." "Mr. Cross." She leaned forward slightly. I didn't ask you here to cross-examine you or to put you on display for my board. I asked you here because I've been running a company for 8 years, and I have learned, sometimes the hard way, that the one thing you cannot train or incentivize or manufacture in a person is the thing you demonstrated in that hallway. You can teach strategy, you can teach systems, process, analysis. You can teach people to get better at things they're already decent at. She paused. You cannot teach someone to stand up when there's no audience and nothing to gain and real cost on the table. Either it's in them or it isn't. Damon looked at her carefully. He had the instinct, which he recognized as self-protective, to say something deflective, to point out that he'd just lost his job and was behind on 2 credit cards and probably wasn't the leadership archetype she was building toward in this conversation. But he also knew that deflection was sometimes just another word for fear, and he was trying to be honest with himself about the difference. What are you offering? He said. I'm not offering anything yet. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to have a longer conversation. She said it plainly. My regional operations are going to go through significant restructuring in the next few months. I need people in leadership positions who understand logistics from the ground up and can rebuild team cultures that have been damaged. I've been looking at your employment history, the analyst work, and before that. She looked at him steadily. Before that. He held her gaze. The before that sat between them like a door she'd opened without walking through, giving him the choice. I led a team, he said. Different context. Leadership is leadership, she said. The context changes the tools. It doesn't change the fundamentals. You don't know that, he said. It wasn't combative, just honest. You know what I did in a hallway? That's not much of a sample size. It's more than you think. She sat back. Most people in that building had seen how Craig Whitmore operated. Not one of them said a word to his face. Not in 3 weeks, not in 3 years, by some accounts. She looked at him with the directness of someone who'd decided a long time ago that the time saved by being direct was worth whatever social friction it sometimes created. You didn't calculate it, you just did it. I calculated it, he said. I just didn't like where the calculation came out if I didn't act. She was quiet for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not softer exactly, but more present, the look of someone who had been listening carefully and had just heard something that mattered. Then you understand exactly what I'm trying to build, she said. He looked at his hands on the table. The scar on his jaw caught the light. He thought about Emma this morning, watching him put on his ironed shirt, saying good luck in the quiet way of someone who understood more than you'd told them. He thought about Mrs. Okonkwo, with the bag already checked. He thought about the framed photo now sitting in a grocery bag in his trunk, and the spare inhaler in his jacket pocket, and the job board with its 11 pending applications. He thought about what the next 3 weeks looked like, and the 3 after that, and the number his savings account was going to become. And then he put all of that aside, because what was in front of him was a conversation, and he'd always been better at conversations when he took them one sentence at a time instead of trying to see the whole map. Tell me more about what the restructuring looks like, he said. Serena reached for a second document in the folder. She set it on the table between them and began to talk, and Damon listened the way he'd learned to listen a long time ago. Not just to the words, but to the architecture underneath them, the shape of what someone was actually trying to build, and whether the foundation they were describing could hold the weight they were putting on it. It could, he thought, or it could, with the right people. Whether he was the right person, that he didn't know yet. But the question, he realized, didn't frighten him the way it might have frightened a different version of himself. The version that had been sitting at a logistics desk for 3 years, running numbers and going home, keeping his head below a radar that wasn't even watching for someone like him. That version of himself had been safe and small and was now unemployed. He kept listening. Outside, the thin November sun held. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. At some point, a quiet assistant came in with coffee and water and set them on the table and left without disrupting anything, which Damon noted as a small organizational detail that said something about how this place ran. He drank the coffee. Serena drank the water. She had a legal pad she sometimes wrote on, quick phrases that seemed to function more as anchors for her thinking than as actual notes. She was not a person who needed to write things down to remember them. He could tell that within the first 20 minutes. She was also not a person who oversold things, which he found more reassuring than he would have found the alternative. She was direct about the problems in the regional division she was discussing. The damaged trust, the workflow breakdowns that had accumulated under management that had been more invested in appearances than outcomes, the employees who would need time before they believed that things were actually different. She didn't dress any of it up. She laid it out as a problem set that needed solving, which was exactly how he would have laid it out. You'd have authority, she said, not advisory, not subject to committee approval on every decision, real authority to hire, to restructure, to set the culture you believe in. With oversight, obviously, I'm not handing anyone a blank check, but I want someone who's going to own it, not manage it from arm's length. What's the timeline for the restructuring announcement? 4 to 6 weeks, pending legal clearance on the fraud side, which my counsel says is straightforward given the documentation. And the people currently in mid-level leadership in that division? Some will stay. Some won't fit what the division needs to be. She looked at him steadily. That's a judgment call I'd expect whoever's leading it to make. Not my call. You'd trust someone you've known for 90 minutes to make that call? I'd trust someone with the right instincts who is also willing to be accountable for the outcome, she said. The 90 minutes is enough to tell me about the instincts. Accountability is what the trial period is for. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet, which was another thing he noted. She didn't fill silence the way most people did, didn't mistake a pause for an invitation to elaborate. She just waited. My daughter's medical coverage, he said finally. I need to understand what that looks like before any other conversation is real. She didn't flinch at the directness of it. Executive health care plan. Comprehensive, no cap on specialist coverage, prescription coverage without the tier limits you were dealing with at Hargrove, effective from first day of employment. She paused. I had the specific gaps from your prior coverage identified. We cover them. He looked at her. There was something almost uncomfortable about being on this end of it, being the subject of research rather than conducting it, having someone lay out the specific geometry of your vulnerabilities as a way of demonstrating they'd accounted for them. He understood why she'd done it. He even respected the efficiency of it. But it was a strange thing to sit inside. You did a lot of work, he said, before you knew whether I'd even come to this meeting. I do a lot of work on everything, she said. It's not a guarantee of outcome. I just find it reduces the number of surprises. He nodded once more. He straightened the document in front of him without looking at it. I'll need to think about it, he said. That's a reasonable answer. A few days. Take what you need. He stood. She stood. They shook hands across the table, and her handshake was direct and brief, the handshake of someone who had stopped performing it a long time ago and now just did it. He was almost at the door when she said his name. He turned. She was still standing at the table. She had the $20 bill in her hand, and she held it out to him. This is yours, she said. He looked at it. Keep it, he said. Call it a security deposit. He didn't explain what he meant by that. He didn't need to. From the look on her face, she understood. He walked out through the quiet corridor, past the plain walls, through the glass doors, and into the elevator. He rode down alone. He walked through the lobby and out onto Vance Street, where the November air was cold and direct, and the city was making all its usual sounds. He sat in his car for a moment. Not 5 minutes this time, just a moment. Then he took out his phone and called Mrs. Okonkwo. Emma gets out at 3, he said, when she picked up. Can you pick her up today? I'll be a little late. 8. Of course, she said, and then, because she was Mrs. Okonkwo, you sound different. Do I? Yes. A pause. Good different or bad different? He thought about it honestly, which was something he tried to do with questions that deserved it. I don't know yet, he said, but I think maybe good. He drove home through traffic that was already thickening with the late afternoon, and the city moved past the windows the way it always did, and he let himself think carefully about what the next few days might need to look like, and what he was going to say to Emma, and what it meant to step back into something bigger than the space he'd been living in for 3 years. He didn't have answers for most of it. He rarely did, going in. That had never stopped him before. He took 2 days. Not because he needed 2 days to decide. He knew, somewhere around the drive home on Wednesday, that he was going to say yes. What he needed the 2 days for was to make sure he was saying yes for the right reasons. And not just because the alternative was frightening, which was a distinction that had mattered to him for a long time, in contexts a lot higher stakes than this one. Decisions made from fear had a particular quality. They felt like decisions, but they were actually just reactions, and reactions compounded in ways that were hard to correct later. So he took 2 days. He went through the documents Serena had given him, a detailed brief on the Southeast Regional Division, its current structure, its performance data, its workforce composition. He read it the way he read everything that mattered, slowly, making notes in the margin in his small handwriting, flagging the numbers that felt wrong and the ones that were conspicuously absent. He cross-referenced what he could against public freight industry data he pulled from trade publications online. He built a rough picture of what the division actually was versus what its internal reporting had claimed it was. And the gap between those two pictures was significant enough that he spent an hour just sitting with it before he moved on. He also spent an evening with a legal pad doing what he privately called a cost accounting, not of money, but of everything else. What it would require of him. What it would require of Emma. Whether he was the person the job needed or whether he was, in some important way, flattering himself. That last part was the hardest, because self-flattery was a failure mode he'd seen destroy competent people. He'd watched officers in the field make catastrophic calls because they'd been so thoroughly convinced of their own capability that they'd lost the ability to accurately read a situation. He had no interest in being that person. He'd always found that genuine humility, not performed humility, but the real version, the kind that came from having been wrong in costly ways before and remembering it clearly, was the only reliable protection against it. By that accounting, what he had was this. He understood logistics from the ground up, analytically and operationally. He understood how teams broke down and what it cost to rebuild trust in a group of people who had learned not to trust the people above them. He understood, from experience that didn't appear on any resume, how to make decisions clearly under pressure and live with the outcomes of those decisions without letting the weight of them crush his ability to function. What he didn't have was corporate leadership experience at the level she was describing. And he didn't have the language or the institutional fluency of someone who had spent their career in that world. Those were real gaps. He wrote them down. He didn't minimize them. What he came to, on the second evening, sitting at the kitchen table after Emma was asleep, with his legal pad and his cold coffee, was this. The gaps were real, but they were learnable. The other things, the things Serena had named in the boardroom, with the particular emphasis of someone who had looked for them and not found them. Those were not learnable. You either had them or you'd spent years developing them in conditions that couldn't be replicated. And he'd done the latter, and he knew it, and pretending otherwise to seem appropriately humble was its own form of dishonesty. He called her Thursday morning. She picked up on the second ring. "I'll take it," he said, "with one condition." A brief pause. "Tell me the condition." 90 days. I want a genuine review at 90 days, not a rubber stamp. If the division isn't moving in the right direction by then, or if I'm not the right person to move it, I want that said plainly, and I want both of us to be willing to act on it. Silence for a moment. Then, "That's not a condition. That's just good management." "Then we agree." "We agree," she said. "Monday?" "Monday," he said. He put the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Then he stood, walked to the hallway, and looked in at Emma, who was asleep with her arm thrown over the edge of the bed in the specific graceless way of children who slept without self-consciousness. Her inhaler was on the nightstand, where it always was. Her breathing was even. He stood there for a moment just watching her breathe. Then he went to bed. Monday came with actual sun, the first real sun in 2 weeks, the kind that made the city look briefly like it had been cleaned overnight. Damon drove downtown in it with his windows down 2 inches, which was probably too cold for November, but he wanted the air. Emma had asked him that morning, over cereal, whether he was nervous, and he'd said he wasn't sure, and she'd said that was a pretty honest answer, and he'd said he was trying. "What's the job?" she'd asked. "Regional president. I'll be running a division of a logistics company." She'd considered this. "Is that a big deal?" "Bigger than what I was doing before." "Were you good at what you were doing before?" "At the actual work, yeah." "Then you'll probably be okay." She said it with the simplicity of a person who hadn't yet learned to overcomplicate encouragement, and he'd taken it in the spirit it was offered and thanked her, and she'd gone back to her cereal. The Ashford headquarters on Vance Street had a different quality on a Monday morning than it had on a Wednesday afternoon. Fuller, more purposeful, the lobby moving with people who knew exactly where they were going. The receptionist recognized him and smiled and said Kay Adebayo would be with him shortly, and this time he was taken not to the boardroom but to a smaller conference room on the 21st floor that had a whiteboard and a round table and felt like a place where actual work happened rather than a place where decisions were announced. Kay Adebayo, Kofi, he said, extending a hand, was a compact, precise man in his early 40s who had the quality of someone who had thought carefully about how to do his job well and then done it that way long enough that it had become invisible. He walked Damon through the first 2 weeks, the administrative onboarding, the legal agreements, the HR processes, an orientation to Ashford's operational structure that was both thorough and genuinely interesting because the company's architecture was more sophisticated than anything he'd seen at Hargrove, and it had clearly been built by someone who thought in systems. After that, Kofi said, Damon would begin direct engagement with the Southeast Regional team, starting with individual meetings with every senior staff member before anything else. Ms. Ashford's instruction on that, Kofi said, meet before you move. Don't come in with a plan you built before you understood the people. Good instruction, Damon said. Kofi looked at him with a brief, genuine assessment. She usually gives good ones. Serena appeared at the conference room door at 10:30, which Damon had not expected. She knocked on the door frame. She was already in, but knocked anyway, and said she had 20 minutes if Kofi was finished, and Kofi gathered his materials with the efficient movement of a person who had learned exactly how to read that sentence. She sat down across from Damon with a coffee she'd brought herself, in a plain mug, and she looked like a person who had been at work since before he'd left his apartment, which he suspected was accurate. "How was the weekend?" she asked. It was a simple question that he didn't expect, and the unexpectedness of it made him answer honestly rather than reflexively. "Quiet. I read through the division brief a few times. And? The performance data has been managed," he said. "The real throughput numbers are probably 30% below what's being reported. The workforce attrition over the past 18 months looks passive from the report, normal turnover. But the timing clusters around specific manager tenures in a way that isn't passive at all." She was watching him with the expression he was starting to recognize as her listening face. Still, attentive, not interrupting. "The people who are still there," he continued, "stayed either because they had limited options or because they actually care about the work. That's actually the better foundation to rebuild from, because you know where their investment is. The ones who stayed because they had no choice, you have to figure out who they are and what they need and whether they can shift. The ones who stayed because they care, those are your anchors. How do you identify which is which? You talk to them," he said. "Not about the job, about how the job has been. What's worked and what hasn't. People who stayed because they care will tell you exactly what's broken because they've been thinking about it for months and nobody's asked. People who stayed because they had no choice will give you the answer they think you want." She nodded slowly. "That's what I thought," she said. "I wanted to hear you say it." He understood that too. The confirmation instinct, the checking of a perception against someone else's read. "You do that often," he said. "State a thing and see if someone else arrives at it independently." She seemed briefly surprised that he'd named it. Then something in her expression relaxed slightly, in the way of someone who has been operating at a particular level of guardedness for a long time, and occasionally remembers there are people it's not necessary with. "It's how I check my own thinking," she said. "I try to notice when I've already decided something, and make sure I'm not just looking for confirmation." "That's harder than it sounds." "I know," she said. "I'm not always good at it." It was a small admission, offered plainly, and it sat between them for a moment without either of them making it into something larger than it was. She asked him if he had questions about the operational structure. He had several, and they talked through them, and she answered without deferring or hedging, the way someone answers who has built the thing they're describing and knows it in the specific way you know things you've made with your own hands. He asked about the vendor relationships in the Southeast region, which were going to need auditing, and about the middle management layer whose loyalty profile was unclear, and about the IT infrastructure, which the brief had described in terms vague enough to suggest something was being glossed over. "The IT infrastructure is a problem," she said without enjoyment. "It's been inadequately maintained for about 3 years because the previous oversight team kept approving maintenance budgets and then redirecting the funds. You'll need to prioritize an assessment in the first 30 days. Who do I pull for that? Internal? I'll give you a name. There's a systems architect in the central division who's been waiting for a real project. She's good. She paused. She has opinions. Good. Opinions mean investment. Serena almost smiled at that. It was the same almost smile he'd seen in the parking garage, and it had the same quality, like something genuine that had learned to be careful. At 10:50, she stood to leave. At the door, she turned back, and there was a slightly different quality to the pause before she spoke. I want to say something, she said, and I want to say it once and not make a thing of it. He waited. What you did in that hallway cost you something real, she said. I know that. I want you to know I know that, and that this, she gestured briefly, encompassing the building, the conversation, everything that had followed from a Thursday evening in a rain-wet corridor, is not charity. I don't operate that way. You're here because you're the right person for what I need done. She paused. But I also don't want to pretend the timing is coincidental. It's not. And you deserve to have that said plainly. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said, and I'm not interested in pretending either. But for what it's worth, I'd have come in anyway. The job is real. The work is real. He paused. That's enough. She held his gaze for a second more. Then she nodded, once, and left. And he sat alone in the conference room for a moment with the November sun coming through the windows at an angle that made everything look slightly warmer than it was. The Southeast Regional Division operated out of a facility in a commercial district 40 minutes south of downtown, a sprawling complex of offices, a distribution coordination center, and a trucking dispatch hub that ran 3 shifts, all of it organized around a central operations floor that was, Damon discovered on his first visit, considerably more chaotic than it appeared on any report he'd read. He spent his first week doing exactly what Kofi had relayed, meeting people before moving anything. He did it in the small conference room adjacent to the operations floor, one at a time, starting with the senior staff and working through to team leads and then floor supervisors. He scheduled them for 45 minutes each and told the assistant who coordinated it, a young woman named Priya who had been with the division for 4 years and had the look of someone who had survived by being indispensable, that he didn't need anything prepared for these meetings. No presentations, no data summaries, just the person. Most of them came in guarded. That was understandable. The previous 6 months had been, by any honest account, a sustained organizational trauma, leadership removal, federal audit involvement, rumors that had been more accurate than the official communications, which were almost always the worst combination. Damon had been in enough situations where trust had been comprehensively broken to recognize what it looked like from the inside, which was mostly a lot of very careful, very controlled people saying the minimum required and watching his face for information. He didn't push against it. He just asked questions and listened, and when someone said something real, something that cracked slightly out of the controlled register into the actual texture of what they'd been living through, he didn't react to it the way a manager was supposed to react, with reassurance and pivot to positive. He just acknowledged it. Sometimes that was all that was needed. A simple that sounds like it was a rough year that didn't immediately redirect into. But here's the plan going forward. The redirect came later. The acknowledgement had to come first, or the redirect meant nothing. By the end of the first week, he had a clearer picture of the division than any document had given him. He had names and functions, but more importantly, he had the human architecture, who the actual informal leaders were, which were different from the organizational chart leaders, which was always the case. He had a sense of where the fracture lines were, and which ones were structural, and which were interpersonal, and which were just the accumulated grime of a long bad period that would clear with time and different conditions. He also had a sense of who was going to be a problem. There were 3 mid-level managers who had been, from everything he could gather, not complicit in the fraud exactly, but adjacent to it. People who had known more than they'd reported, who had calculated that silence was the safer choice, and had been right about that calculation right up until they weren't. He didn't move on them immediately. He watched. He gave them room to show him whether they were capable of recalibrating or whether they'd already decided to run the same calculus under the new administration. One of them, a logistics coordinator named Brent, mid-40s, who had the precise, worried energy of a man waiting for the floor to fall through, came to him at the end of the second week. He knocked on the door of the small office Damon had been given while the main regional office was being prepared, and stood in the doorway with the posture of a man who'd talked himself into something and was trying not to talk himself back out. "I want to tell you something," Brent said. "Sit down," Damon said. Brent sat. He spent about 40 seconds organizing whatever he was about to say, and Damon let him have the 40 seconds. And then Brent told him. There were 2 vendor contracts that hadn't been flagged in the federal audit because they'd been structured through a subsidiary that hadn't been part of the initial review scope. He'd known about them for 7 months. He'd written a memo flagging concerns and then withdrawn the memo because of what he'd seen happen to people who flagged concerns. And the withdrawal had felt like safety and had never stopped feeling like a wrong choice. He gave Damon the contract numbers and the subsidiary name and the name of the senior manager who'd arranged them. His voice was steady, which Damon suspected had cost him something. When he finished, Damon sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to turn this over to legal and the audit team today. Your name will be in the disclosure because the record needs to be accurate. But the fact that you came forward, and when, that's part of the record too." "Will I still have a job?" Brent asked. He asked it plainly, without trying to dress it up as something other than the central question. Damon looked at him. "I don't make promises about outcomes I don't control. But I can tell you that I needed to know whether the people in this division were capable of doing the right thing when it cost them something." He paused. "I just got my answer on you." Brent left. Damon made 2 phone calls, forwarded the contract information to Serena's legal team, and then sat for a moment before going back to the work. The second month was harder than the first, in the ways that second months are always harder. The initial energy of a new thing had settled, and what was left was the actual work, which was structural and unglamorous and required a particular kind of patience that Damon had developed over years of situations where patience had not been optional. He rebuilt the reporting system first because everything else depended on having numbers he could trust. He brought in the systems architect Serena had mentioned, a woman named Diana Park, who did in fact have opinions, sharp ones, and who also had the specific gift of being able to explain exactly why something was broken in terms that made the fix obvious. They spent 3 weeks in the operational data together, Diana explaining the infrastructure failures, and Damon asking the questions that connected technical failure to operational consequence. And by the end of it, they had a reporting architecture that was honest in a way the previous one hadn't been, which meant the numbers it produced were initially worse than anything that had been officially acknowledged. And Damon sent those numbers to Serena without softening them. She called him the afternoon she received them. "These are bad," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's what they actually are." A pause. "How long to turn them?" Honest answer, 6 to 8 months before the trend line is clearly moving. Individual metrics sooner. Some of it depends on factors outside the division's control. Understood. Another pause. "Thank you for not adjusting them." "That was never going to happen," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it anyway." He spent the middle of the second month on the culture work, which was slower and less measurable, and the part he found most draining, not because it was difficult in a technical sense, but because it required a quality of sustained emotional attention that he wasn't sure he'd exercised in this particular way before. He had to hold space, simultaneously, for people who were frightened, people who were cynical, people who had been cynical, and were cautiously considering whether the new conditions were genuinely different, and people who were simply trying to do good work and needed to be protected from the organizational noise long enough to do it. He held what he called open hours, 2 hours on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, where anyone in the division could come to his office without an appointment and say whatever they needed to say. He'd expected a modest number of people to use it. The volume surprised him. People came with operational problems, personnel concerns, long festering resentments about equipment that had never been replaced, processes that had never made sense to anyone who actually did the work. He took notes on everything. He resolved what he could resolve immediately. He was honest about what would take time and specific about why. Priya told him at the end of the second month that people were talking differently. Not like, "They love the new management, everything is great," she said carefully. More like, "They're not waiting to see if it gets bad again, most of them." "Most," he said. "Progress is progress," she said. He found he liked Priya. She had a particular quality he valued. She told him things he needed to know without waiting to be asked, and she did it without performing loyalty or angling for credit, because she genuinely cared how the place ran. He made a note to have a direct conversation with her about her own career trajectory within the division, because that conversation was overdue and she deserved to have it. Serena came to the division facility at the 6-week mark, unannounced, which he'd been told was something she did, and which he'd already accounted for by running the division the same way whether or not anyone was watching, which was the only approach he knew. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, which was one of his open hours days, and he happened to be in the middle of a conversation with a floor supervisor named Marcus, who was working through a personnel issue on his team, and he didn't cut it short when he saw her come through the door. She found a chair in the outer office and waited until the conversation was done, which took 20 more minutes. When Marcus left, she came in. "You made me wait," she said, not accusatorially, more like she was noting a data point. "He needed the time," Damon said. She sat down. She looked around the office, sparse, organized, the framed photo of Emma on the corner of the desk, a whiteboard with a system map he'd drawn himself covering most of one wall. She looked at the whiteboard for a moment. "Walk me through it," she said. He walked her through it. The whole system map, the reporting architecture, the vendor audit status, the personnel changes he'd made and why, the ones he was still watching, the timeline he was working to. It took 40 minutes. She asked questions throughout, sharp ones, the kind that tested whether the map reflected reality or just a version of reality he'd decided to believe. He answered them directly, including the 3 places where he said, "I don't know yet, and here's what I'm doing to find out." When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The Brent situation," she said. "I wanted to ask you about how you handled it." "He came forward voluntarily," Damon said. "That mattered." "You didn't promise him his job." "No. But he still has it. He's good at what he does, and he made a correctable mistake under conditions that weren't fair to anyone," Damon said. "What he does next is what I'm watching." She looked at him steadily. "Some people would have made an example of him." "I know," he said. "Some situations need an example. That one needed something different." "How do you know the difference?" He thought about it honestly. "I've made both calls. I've been wrong in both directions. You get a feel for it." He paused. "And you stay close enough to the people involved to notice when your read was off and correct it before it costs too much." She nodded slowly. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "Do you think I made the right call, bringing you in?" He looked at her. The question was real. He could tell the difference by now between her testing mode and her genuine question mode, and this was the latter. "I think you made a reasonable bet based on limited information," he said. "Whether it was right depends on what happens next." "That's a very careful answer." "It's an honest one." She almost smiled, the same one. "Yes," she said. "It is." She stayed for another hour, walking the operations floor, talking to people without Damon steering the conversations, which he understood was intentional and didn't try to manage. He watched her from the operations center window, watched how she listened, how she asked questions of a floor worker the same way she asked them of a senior manager, how people's posture changed when they realized she was actually interested in what they said. He thought about what it had cost her to build something and then discover it had been damaged from the inside by people she'd trusted, and he thought she'd probably been carrying that in a particular way that didn't have a clean release, and he respected that she was here on the floor rather than managing it from a distance. That evening, in the parking lot, she stopped next to his car. "The 90-day review," she said. "I'm adjusting the framing." He waited. "I'm not reviewing whether you're the right person," she said. "I know you are. I'm reviewing what you need from me to do the job better." She looked at him directly. "That's a different question." He considered that. "That's a generous adjustment." "It's an accurate one," she said. "There's a difference." He drove home in the dark, and the city moved past the windows, and he thought about accuracy and generosity and whether the line between them was as clear as people like to believe, and he didn't arrive at a definitive answer, which seemed about right. Emma was still awake when he got home, nominally doing homework, but actually reading a book about migratory birds she'd taken out of the library, which she'd been working through at a pace that suggested she was enjoying it significantly more than she let on. "How was it?" she said without looking up. "Good," he said. "Getting better." "That's what you said last week." "It keeps being true." She turned a page. He went to the kitchen to heat up the dinner Mrs. Okonkwo had left in covered dishes on the stove, a habit she'd started without being asked early in the 3rd week, and that he'd tried to compensate for in a way she'd declined with the same mild impatience as always. He ate at the kitchen table with his laptop open to the next day's schedule, and Emma came in eventually and sat across from him and ate the last of the rice and told him. The blackpoll warbler flew as many as 12,000 miles in a single migratory season, and he said that was remarkable. And she said she thought it was kind of sad too, and he asked why, and she said because it seemed like a long way to go to end up somewhere that wasn't where you started. He thought about that for a moment. Sometimes where you end up is better than where you started, he said, even if the distance was hard. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that seemed worth considering. Maybe, she said, I just think it should get to choose. Yeah, he said, I think so too. She went back to her room. He sat for a while longer at the table, not working, just sitting, and outside the apartment window. The city was doing what cities do at night, all those lit windows, all those separate lives going through their own sequences, arriving and departing in patterns too complex to track. He wasn't melancholy about it. He was, in a way he didn't have a better word for, simply present in it, which was not something he'd been particularly good at in the years since his wife died. Being present without bracing for the next thing. He didn't know when that had started to shift, somewhere in the last 6 weeks probably, in the accumulation of days that had required him to actually show up instead of just endure. He closed the laptop. He turned off the kitchen light. He checked on Emma, who was asleep now with the bird book face down on her chest and her breathing even, and her face entirely unguarded in the way of children who hadn't yet learned to sleep cautiously. He picked up the book and set it on her nightstand. He turned off her lamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at his daughter in the dark, listening to her breathe. Then he went to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could specifically remember, he was asleep before midnight. The 90-day review happened on a Thursday morning in mid-February, in the same small conference room on the 21st floor where Kofi had walked Damon through his first week. Outside the windows, the city was doing its winter thing, gray sky, bare trees, the particular bleakness of a February that hadn't decided to become March yet. Damon drove in with the heat on and his coffee in the cup holder and his notes from the past 3 months in a folder on the passenger seat. Not because he needed the notes, but because having them felt like showing up prepared, which was a habit too old to break. Serena was already there when he arrived. So was Kofi, and Diana Park from Systems, and a woman named Renata from the board's operations committee who had attended 2 of the monthly reviews and asked the kind of questions that told you someone had actually read the materials beforehand. There was coffee on the table and a legal pad in front of every chair, and the whiteboard at the end of the room had been wiped clean, which felt somehow intentional. He put his folder down and sat. Serena looked at him across the table with the expression he'd come to understand meant she'd already formed a view and was waiting to see if the conversation confirmed or complicated it. Before we go into the data, she said, I want to hear from you, not the numbers. How do you think the division is? He'd known she would ask something like this. She had a consistent preference for the human read before the quantitative one, not because she distrusted the numbers, but because she'd told him once, during one of their Thursday calls, that numbers told you what had already happened and people told you what was about to happen, and she wanted both inputs in the right order. Fragile, he said. Better than it was. Still fragile. Renata made a note. Kofi looked at him steadily. The performance metrics are moving, Damon continued. Throughput is up 14% from the baseline we established in December. Vendor audit is complete. The 2 contracts Brent flagged have been fully unwound with no additional exposure beyond what legal already documented. Attrition has dropped significantly. He paused. But the cultural recovery is slower than the operational recovery, and that's the part I want to be honest about. You can fix a process in a week. You cannot fix 3 years of people learning not to trust the people above them in 3 months. We've made real progress. The people there are genuinely trying, but there are still moments where someone flinches before they speak in a meeting, and until that's gone, I don't think we're where we need to be. The room was quiet for a moment. How long? Renata asked. Another quarter before I'd call it stable, Damon said. Not fixed. Stable. The real test is what happens when something goes wrong. And something will go wrong. That's just operations. And whether people bring it forward or cover it. We haven't had that test yet. Serena looked at him. You know, most people in your position would give me a more optimistic read. I know, he said. I'm not most people in my position. Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the thing adjacent to it that she used when she thought something was true and was glad it had been said. "No," she said. "You're not." They went into the data after that, and the data was good, genuinely good, not managed to look good, which Damon had fought for in small ways every week, when the temptation to round up or frame generously was always quietly present. Good numbers that were honest numbers had a different quality than good numbers that had been handled, and he believed, perhaps more than he could fully justify, that people could feel the difference even when they couldn't articulate it. Diana walked through the IT infrastructure assessment, which had been brutal and was now approximately 60% resolved, which was more than he'd expected at 90 days. She presented with her characteristic precision and her characteristic opinions, and when Renata pushed back on the timeline for the remaining 40%, Diana pushed back on the pushback with the calm confidence of someone who was right about something technical and knew it. Damon watched Renata reconsider and revise her position, which she did gracefully, and he made a note to tell Diana afterward that she'd done well. The meeting ran 2 hours. At the end, Renata said she was satisfied with the direction and had what she needed for the board summary, and she left with Kofi, and it was just Damon and Serena and the cleaned whiteboard and the gray February outside. She poured herself the last of the coffee, which had been sitting long enough to be barely worth it, and drank it anyway. "I want to talk about your next quarter," she said. "All right. I want to expand your scope." She said it carefully, which was not her usual mode, and the carefulness told him something. There are 2 other regional divisions that need the same thing the Southeast Division needed. Not as bad. The fraud doesn't extend there, or not in the same way, but the culture problems do. The management style that Whitmore and his network established filtered into those divisions over time, because people copy what they see being rewarded. She looked at him. "I could promote different people into those roles. I have competent people. But what I found in the Southeast, what you built there, even fragile, is different from what competent management would have built. And I'm aware that asking you to expand before the first thing is fully stable is a significant ask." He thought about it. Not for show. Actually thought about it. The real logistical weight of it, what it would require, what it would pull away from what he was still building. "I'd need to develop someone in the Southeast to carry it while I'm split," he said. "Not just hand it off. Actually develop them. That takes time." "I know." "Priya," he said. "I want to talk to you about Priya." Serena raised an eyebrow slightly. "The operations assistant?" "She's not an assistant. She's been running the operational coordination of that division informally for 2 years. She knows where everything is. She knows which relationships matter. She understands the work from the inside. She's been doing assistant-level work because that's the title she was given, and nobody looked closely enough to see what the title was missing." He paused. "I want to bring her up formally. Give her real authority and real compensation and a development path. If she's willing to step into it, she's my answer for how I expand without abandoning what we're building." Serena was quiet for a moment. Then, "Have you talked to her about it?" "Not yet. I wanted to understand the scope of what you're proposing before I made her a promise about something that might change." Serena looked at him with the expression he'd first seen in the boardroom, that quality of seeing something clearly and deciding it was worth saying. "That's a good instinct," she said quietly. "Most people would have already told her." "Most people would have been offering her something they didn't fully control yet," Damon said. The conversation ran another 40 minutes and covered the 2 divisions, their specific problems, their personnel structures, the timeline Serena had in mind. She was, he'd learned, a person who came to meetings having already done the thinking and used the conversation to test and refine it, rather than to begin it, which was efficient and occasionally meant you had to push back to make sure the refinement was actually happening and not just ratification. He pushed back twice, once on the timeline, which he thought was too fast, and once on a personnel decision in one of the other divisions that she'd already half made and that he thought was based on a misread of who was driving the cultural problem there. She listened to both pushbacks. She adjusted the timeline. On the personnel question, she didn't fully change her position, but she agreed to hold it open for another month while Damon spent time with the division, which was the reasonable outcome. Walking out to the elevator, she said without preamble, "You push back differently than most people who report to me." "Too much?" he said. "No," she said. "The right amount. It's just noticeable. She paused. Most people calibrate their pushback to what they think I can hear. You calibrate it to what you think is true. Those should be the same thing, he said. They're not, usually, she said. That's the problem. He thought about that on the drive back to the division, about how power changed the acoustics of a room, how the same words landed differently depending on who said them and from where. How the most dangerous thing about authority was not that it corrupted judgment, but that it corrupted feedback, slowly and invisibly, until the person at the top was operating on information that had been curated by everyone around them without anyone consciously deciding to curate it. He'd seen that failure mode in other contexts. He was aware it could happen here. He intended to keep being the person who calibrated to what was true, and he knew that intention would be tested in ways that weren't yet visible, and he thought the knowing was the only real protection. He talked to Priya the following Monday. He asked her to come in at the end of the day, which was a different time than the usual operational conversations. And she arrived with the composed alertness of someone who had learned to read scheduling changes as information. He told her what he'd seen, specifically, not as a general compliment, but the actual specifics. The moments he'd watched her manage situations that were above her title. The decisions she'd made without authority, because someone had to make them, and she'd been the only person paying close enough attention. He told her about the conversation with Serena. He told her what he wanted to offer her and what it would require. She was quiet for a long moment when he finished, long enough that he didn't try to fill it. I've been doing this work for 2 years, she said. The real work. Without the title. I know, he said. That's... She stopped. Started again. I'm not sure if I'm angry about that or just. She shook her head slightly. I don't know. Both, probably, he said. That's reasonable. She looked at him. Why now? Why you? Nobody else noticed. It was a fair question, and he gave it a fair answer. Some people noticed and decided it was convenient, he said. I noticed and decided it was a problem. That's not virtue. It's just a different calculation about what a place needs to actually work. She was quiet again. Then, if I take this and it doesn't work, if I'm not what you think I am, then we figure that out together, he said. I'm not offering you a test. I'm offering you a role. There's a difference. She looked at her hands on the table. She had the expression of someone doing something they'd thought about for a long time and were now discovering was harder than the thinking had been, which was always the case with real decisions. Okay, she said finally. Yes, I want to try. Good, he said. We start structuring it this week. She nodded. She stood to leave, and at the door she turned back with an expression that was slightly different from all her professional expressions. Less composed, more direct. Thank you, she said. Not for the opportunity, just for seeing it. He understood the distinction. You did the work, he said. I just read it accurately. Spring came slowly, the way it always did in that part of the country, a gradual and unconvincing warming that kept threatening to reverse itself before it finally didn't. Emma's pulmonologist appointment in March was the first one Damon had attended without doing the math in the parking lot beforehand. The mental arithmetic of cost against coverage, against the balance of things he still owed that had been a background calculation of nearly every medical visit for 3 years. The new coverage was comprehensive in the way the word had always seemed aspirational before, and walking into that appointment with the referral already processed and the specialist fees already covered felt like a change in atmospheric pressure, but the same room, the same doctor, but the air in it entirely different. The doctor was cautiously optimistic. Emma's lung function numbers had improved by a margin that wasn't dramatic but was consistent, which was the better kind. She was managing her triggers better. She'd gotten methodical about it, in the way she got methodical about things she cared about, tracking what made it worse in the small notebook she kept on her nightstand. The doctor said the consistency of the management was doing as much work as the medication, and Emma accepted this information with the equanimity of a person who had worked for something and was not entirely surprised to find it working. In the car afterward, Emma said, "She said I'm doing better." "She did," Damon said. "Is that because of the new medicine or because of what I'm doing?" He thought about this honestly. Both. The medicine gives you more room. What you do with the room is on you. She considered this. That seems fair, she said. It did, he thought. It seemed fair in this way that most things that were actually true seemed fair, once you got past the parts that were just hard. He moved into the expanded scope in April. The two additional divisions were in different cities, one in the Mid-Atlantic, one in the Midwest, and the work required a travel rhythm he hadn't had since his military years, which was disorienting in some ways and natural in others. He flew out Monday mornings and was back Thursday evenings most weeks, and the Thursdays became a fixed point in the week's structure, in the way that fixed points become necessary when everything else is in motion. Mrs. Okonkwo extended her hours without being asked, which he compensated for directly, and she accepted without the usual deflection, which told him she understood the shift was real and sustained rather than temporary. Emma was philosophical about the travel in the way she was philosophical about most things. She asked where he was going and what the cities were like and whether he'd seen anything interesting. And he sent her photos when he remembered to and called every evening when he could, and she told him about school and about the bird book she'd finished, and the new one she'd started, which was about ocean migration. And she told him the Pacific salmon swam upstream to die in the exact river where they were born, which she found both sad and impressive. Impressive because they make it back? He asked, on the phone from a hotel room in Cincinnati. Impressive because they know where back is, she said. He sat with that for a moment in the hotel room, with its generic furniture and its window looking out at a city he was still learning. Yeah, he said, I think that's it exactly. The Mid-Atlantic Division was harder than the Southeast had been, in different ways. The operational problems were less severe, but the personnel situation was more entrenched. There were people there who had been in their roles for a decade and had built their identities around those roles in ways that made change feel personal in a way it wasn't. And navigating that required a kind of patience that had to be active rather than just the absence of impatience. He made mistakes there. He moved too fast on two personnel decisions he should have let breathe longer, and the friction that resulted cost him 2 weeks and a conversation with Serena that was uncomfortable in the specific way of a conversation where the other person is being accurate and you know it. You treated it like the Southeast, she said. On the phone, on a Tuesday evening, her voice level and without heat. It's not the Southeast. I know, he said. I was wrong. A pause. What's the correction? He told her what he was going to do differently. She listened without interrupting and then said she thought it was right and asked if he needed anything from the center to support it, and he said no, he had what he needed, and that was the end of the conversation. No prolonged post-mortem. No performance of accountability. Just the thing and the correction and moving forward. He appreciated that more than he could easily express. He'd worked in structures where mistakes had to be managed, packaged, and presented in ways that minimized them and protected the person who made them from the full weight of being wrong. He had no patience for that and never had. Being wrong was just part of the work. What mattered was whether you could see it clearly and correct without letting the correction become its own production. The Midwest Division was better. Smaller, more cohesive, with a natural informal leader in a logistics manager named Theo, who had been doing everything right in a structure that had been doing almost everything wrong, and who responded to the change in environment with the particular energy of a good plant that had been in bad soil. Damon spent 2 weeks building the framework with Theo, and then largely got out of the way and watched, which was, he was coming to understand, the highest expression of the thing he was trying to do. Not building something himself, building the conditions in which other people could build. Priya was running the Southeast Division, not perfectly. There were moments where she second-guessed herself in ways that cost time, and moments where she was too deferential to people she should have pushed back on, which were the predictable growing edges of someone in a new authority and not cause for alarm, just cause for the specific kind of support that looked less like instruction and more like a weekly phone call where he asked what she was seeing and listened to the answer and asked what she was thinking of doing about it. She generally had good instincts. The work was in trusting them. She called him one evening in May, later than their usual check-ins, and he could tell from the first sentence that something had happened. I had to let someone go today, she said. Terrence, from the operations floor. He knew Terrence, mid-30s, competent, one of the people he'd flagged early as someone who cared about the work. What happened? He falsified a delivery timeline report, she said. Pressure from a client, he said. He thought it would smooth over a problem. It made the problem worse, and it made us wrong to the client. And when I found it, She stopped. It wasn't malicious. He was trying to fix something. But you let him go. Yeah. A pause. I don't know if that was right. I keep thinking about it. Damon sat with it for a moment. He understood why she was calling, not because she wanted him to tell her she'd made the right call. She was past needing that kind of reassurance. She was calling because she'd made a hard call, and she was sitting inside the hardness of it and wanted to do that with someone who understood what that felt like. Did you talk to him about why? He asked. For a long time, she said. He understood. Did it feel punitive, or did it feel like the line had to hold? A long pause. The line, she said. It felt like the line. Then you made the right call, he said. It doesn't stop feeling bad. That's actually how you know it was real, and not just mechanical. She was quiet for a moment. Is this the test? She asked. The one you said would come? He thought about that. Probably one of them, he said. There's not usually just one. Okay, she said, steady. Okay? After he hung up, he sat in the quiet of his home office. He'd converted the second bedroom closet into a workspace for the travel weeks, a small desk and a good lamp and a whiteboard of his own. And he thought about what the work actually was when you pulled back from the metrics and the org charts and the quarterly reviews. It was this, mostly. The phone calls. The conversations that didn't appear in any report. The people at inflection points where the decision they made would shape what kind of person they became, and the understanding that you couldn't make those decisions for them. You could only make sure they weren't making them alone. He hadn't known he'd be good at that part. He'd known he was organized and analytical and capable under pressure. He hadn't known that what he'd actually accumulated in the years of leading people in situations where the cost of failure was higher than spreadsheets could measure was this: the ability to be present with someone in the difficulty without trying to resolve the difficulty prematurely, to hold space without filling it. That wasn't in any job description. It was just what the work needed. The $20 bill had been his idea, finally, not Serena's. She'd offered it back to him in the boardroom, and he told her to keep it, and she had, and one afternoon in late April she'd appeared in his office doorway at the Southeast facility with it in a small frame, plain wood, no inscription. She handed it to him without explanation. He looked at it for a moment. The bill was still slightly crumpled even behind the glass, pressed flat, but not quite flat, retaining the memory of having been folded in a wallet and transferred between hands in a parking garage in the rain. I had 3 options, she said. Keep it, give it back, or frame it. I tried the first 2. He hung it on the wall next to the whiteboard, slightly crooked, which he didn't fix. It looked right slightly crooked. It looked like something real that had happened rather than something commemorated. Serena looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down across from him, uninvited, which was a thing she did without self-consciousness because she'd stopped performing casualness a long time ago and just was casual when she was, and the distinction was perceptible. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. That night, the hallway. You knew the risk. You'd calculated it. You said so. Yeah. So what was it? She said. Not why you intervened. What was the thing inside that made the risk acceptable? He thought about it. Really thought about it. Not reaching for the answer that would sound right, but actually going back to the hallway, the sound of Craig's voice, the woman on her knees with the paper towels, the quality of the moment before he'd stood up from his desk. I'd spent 3 years being careful, he said, being strategic about what I spent and didn't spend, what I said and didn't say, what I let go. For Emma. For the coverage, for the stability. All of it reasonable. All of it adding up to a person I wasn't entirely sure was still me. He paused. And in that hallway, there was this clear thing, this undeniable, simple thing. And I thought, if I calculate my way out of this one, I don't know who I am anymore. And not knowing who you are is its own kind of poverty. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the spring was doing its slow work on the trees. Pale green coming through, the tentative first expression of a season that wasn't sure yet how far to commit. Serena looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not assessment, not the careful professional attention, something more unguarded than that. The expression of someone who had heard something land in a place they kept privately. I've been running this company for 8 years, she said. I went undercover in my own building because I couldn't trust what I was being told. Because somewhere along the way, the people around me had learned to manage me instead of inform me, and I didn't catch it until the damage was already done. She paused. I went in as the cleaner because I needed to remember what it felt like to be just a person in a room. No position, no authority, just a person, seeing what was actually there. Did it work? He asked. It worked more than I expected, she said, in ways I didn't anticipate. She looked at the slightly crooked frame on the wall, including that. They were quiet for a moment, and the quiet had the quality of something that didn't need to be resolved. What Damon understood, in that moment, was something he'd been approaching from different angles for months without quite saying it plainly. That the thing he'd been looking for, in the 3 years of careful managing and strategic silence, wasn't stability. Stability was what he'd told himself he was after. What he'd actually been looking for was a place where the work he did matched the person he was, where the cost of integrity wasn't subtracted every week from a balance that was already too low. He'd found it in a way he hadn't planned and couldn't have engineered, which was probably the only way you ever found that particular thing. And Serena, whatever she'd been looking for when she walked into her own building in a cleaning uniform, she'd found something too. Not what she'd expected. The evidence she'd needed was there. But so was this. The proof, in one man standing up in a hallway with nothing to gain, that it was still possible. That people still existed who did the right thing, not because they calculated their way there, but because they couldn't live in their own skin otherwise. She'd built a company on the belief that those people existed, and then she'd spent weeks in the building wondering if she was wrong. And then Damon had stood up. He thought she probably hadn't realized how much she needed that proof until she'd seen it. He thought that was the kind of thing that was very hard to know you needed until it arrived. Emma turned 9 in June. Damon took the Friday off, just took it, without the guilt or the calculation that would have accompanied it a year ago. And they drove 2 hours to the coast, where the water was still too cold to swim in, but the beach was wide and empty, and the sky was the particular clear blue that exists only on early summer mornings before the haze has had time to build. Emma ran on the beach with the specific abandon of a child whose lungs were working. That was the only way Damon could think of it. Not dramatically, not with the swelling gratitude of someone narrating a moment, but just, her lungs were working, and she was running, and the distance she could cover before she needed to slow down was longer than it had been at the beach when she was 6, in the photo on his office desk, squinting into the sun. He walked behind her at a pace that kept her in sight. He had his shoes off, which he never did, and the sand was cool and slightly wet under his feet from the tide pulling back. He thought about the Blackpoll warbler, which flew 12,000 miles and arrived where it needed to be. He thought about the Pacific salmon, which knew where back was. He thought about all the distance that looked like loss that was actually just the shape of arrival, that the geography of a life didn't always show you what it was building until you were somewhere you hadn't planned, looking back at the route. He didn't think of himself as a man whose life had been rescued. That framing felt wrong, too passive, too dependent on the idea that he'd simply been acted upon by circumstance. What he thought, standing on that beach in the early June morning, was that he'd made one decision in a hallway, one choice to be himself without calculating the cost first, and that choice had made a space, and into that space had flowed the rest of it. The boardroom, the conversation, the work, the phone calls, the crooked frame on the office wall. Not as reward, not as the universe paying back a debt, just as consequence. 'Cause moving to effect, the way it always does, indifferent to whether we understand the direction until we're far enough along to see it. Emma circled back to him, slightly breathless, her face bright with the particular satisfaction of having used her body well. She looked up at him. "Happy birthday," he said. "You already said that this morning," she said. "It's still true." She considered this and found it acceptable. She stood next to him looking out at the water, which was green-gray and serious in the way the ocean is when you're not here for swimming. She put her hand in his, which she did less often now that she was 9, and developing opinions about public expressions of affection, but she did it now, and he held it, and they stood there a while. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Do you like your job now?" He thought about it. Not because the answer was complicated, but because she'd asked it seriously and deserved a serious answer. "Yeah," he said, "I do." "Better than before?" "A lot better." She nodded, satisfied. Then, "Is it because of what you did?" The thing that got you fired? He looked down at her. She was watching the water, not him, in the way she sometimes asked the harder questions. Sideways, not direct, giving him room to answer without the weight of being looked at. Partly, he said, but mostly it's because of what I did after. She thought about this. What did you do after? I just kept showing up, he said, even when I didn't know how it was going to go. She considered this for a long moment. The water came up the beach and pulled back, came up and pulled back, doing the thing it had always done, patient and exact. That's all anyone can do, she said, not as wisdom, just as a fact she'd observed. Yeah, he said, I think that's right. The morning held around them. The beach was empty in both directions. Somewhere behind them, the car was parked with her birthday lunch in a cooler in the trunk, a picnic she'd designed herself with the specificity of someone who took food seriously, and they would get to it eventually. But not yet. He stood on the beach with his daughter's hand in his, and the cold sand under his feet, and the ocean doing its patient work in front of them, and he let himself be in it, just in it, without managing it, without calculating what came next, without holding any part of himself in reserve. This was what he'd been protecting all those years. This exact weight in his hand. This specific kid, standing here, breathing the salt air into lungs that were working. He hadn't known, in the hallway that rainy Thursday night, that he was also protecting this, the version of himself that could stand on a beach on a Friday in June and feel it fully. But that was the thing about the choices that came from who you actually were, rather than from what you calculated you could afford. They didn't just protect the obvious things. They protected the capacity to receive the life you were living. And that, it turned out, was not a small thing. It was, in the end, the whole